Hello and welcome to the Chatterbox Letters podcast. Today I will be doing another special presentation. Today I will be reading my self-published book, The Minorites, the Pilot, Chapter 4. I hope that everyone will enjoy listening to me while I read to you The Minorites, the Pilot. This is part of my verbal letter. All right, let me go ahead and get started on Chapter 4 of The Minorites. Chapter 4, Richard's Indiscretions. It was the late afternoon after the long discussion of the Wilkinsons about Sarah's pregnancy. Paul Langston and his daughter Sarah decided to visit Richard and his parents. Sarah and her father, Paul, walked up to the Morrises' front door and knocked. Mr. Eddie Morris, Richard's father, opened his door and was met by Paul and Sarah Langston. "Hello, may I help you?" Paul introduced himself and his daughter to the Morrises. "Hello, sir. I'm here to speak with you about your son, Richard." "And you are?" "Oh, I am Paul Langston, and this is my daughter, Sarah. I would like to speak to you with a situation involving your son and my daughter. If you don't mind, sir, can we come in?" Eddie invited Paul and his daughter, Sarah, into his home. "Yes, please come in. Come into the living room." All right, next page. Paul and Sarah entered the foyer of the Morrises' household. They went straight into the living room and sat down on the couch. "Thanks, sir." Eddie introduced himself to Paul and his daughter. "My name is Eddie Morris. Nice to meet you. Now, what is this situation your daughter has with my son?" Paul prepared himself to explain to Richard's father about his and Sarah's visit to his home. "Well, Mr. Morris, call me Eddie." "Well, Eddie, it of a delicate matter. This has everything to do with my daughter Sarah and your son Richard." Eddie was silenced briefly with concern. He knew that something was not right with the matter of his son Richard and Paul's daughter Sarah. A surprised Eddie questioned Paul. "Oh my God, you're not saying, oh my God, a delicate matter? Is your daughter?" Paul revealed Sarah's pregnancy to Eddie without hesitation. "Yes, my daughter Sarah is pregnant and your son is the father of her baby," Paul said. Eddie quickly stood up from the sofa and rushed into the foyer. Paul rushed behind Eddie. He confirmed the news to Eddie. It's for sure, Eddie. Eddie fiercely paced the foyer of the front door entrance. He was very surprised and shocked by the news of Sarah's pregnancy and the fact that his son Richard was the father. It was no doubt, Paul stated. Eddie still didn't want to believe the fact that Richard was involved in getting Sarah pregnant. He was still in disbelief about Sarah's pregnancy, but still wanted to know for sure. No, you got to be kidding. You just got to be kidding, Mr. Langston. How do you really know this? Sarah answered the question Eddie had directed mainly towards her father, Paul. Because, Mr. Morris, your son Richard was the only boy I've been with. No one else, sir. I promise you that. Richard knows this. Hey, little lady, are you really sure about this? I'm not lying to you, Mr. Morris. And that's a fact. And about this, I'm serious. Richard is the only one. Eddie was enraged with anger about the news he received from Paul Langston about his daughter, Sarah. Eddie called out to Richard to come downstairs. He also called for his wife, Charlotte, to join in the conversation about their son. Okay, all right. Well, get Richard down here right now. Little lady, I assure you, we will get to the bottom of this. Eddie yelled at the bottom of the stairs for Richard in haste. Richard! Boy, get your butt downstairs right now. Right now. Charlotte, you come in here too. You need to hear this. Charlotte exited the kitchen with concern about what was going on in the living room with Eddie and his temper. What's wrong, Eddie? Charlotte came into the living room to see what Eddie was upset about. Charlotte, you will find out when our son reaches the end of his path down the bottom of these stairs. Richard finally came downstairs. He turned towards the living room and saw Sarah and her father, Paul. Sarah and her father, Paul, was staring at the stairway as Richard came down. Richard was very insecure about seeing Sarah and her father, Paul, sitting in the living room. Richard gave a hard and stone look. He decided to play it off and act like he didn't know what was going on. What's up, Pops? Whoa, what's going on here? Sarah, what you doing here? Knowingly, Richard tried to play like he didn't know a thing. Sarah stood up and walked over to Richard. She faced him directly with her answer. Richard, I think you know why I'm here. Quit trying to play me on this one. Richard angrily stared at Sarah like she was a piece of meat with extreme haste. Richard's parents continued questioning him about Sarah's pregnancy. Oh no, Sarah, you are not going to pull this one on me. Next page. Eddie questioned Richard directly as Charlotte looked on. Richard looked over at his father, Eddie. He was reluctant for a moment before he came clean about Sarah's pregnancy and his involvement. Oh yes, Richard. Oh yes. You that child's daddy. Don't lie to your daddy. Don't lie to my face, boy. Charlotte turned and looked over at Richard. Eddie, what's going on? Richard, did what? Eddie? Richard, what did you do? Richard was reluctant to answer his mother's question. I don't know what's going on, Mama. I think I'm being framed. Richard looked back at his father, Eddie. What sort of daddy? Eddie got beyond frustration with Richard. What did you mean, sort of, boy? There is no such thing as sort of. Pops, I don't know. Richard looked at Sarah once again like a stone. Charlotte cried out in shock. Richard, you got a baby on the way? Okay, Mama. Yeah. Charlotte became emotional about the fact that Richard got Sarah pregnant. What's wrong with you, boy? After all we talked about, you do this to me and your father. How could you, Richard? Richard tried to explain himself to his mother, Charlotte. Mama, you don't understand. Richard yelled out to his mother. Eddie gave Richard an ultimatum. You're going to get out of this house tomorrow and you're going to find you a job, Richard. You're not going to be a lollygagging and lagging around this here house. You're going to take care of your responsibility. You got that girl stomach instead of running around in this house acting like a Mac Daddy wannabe pimp. Paul tried to assure his daughter Sarah of the promise he made to her just before they arrived at the Morris's household to speak with Richard's parents, so that she wouldn't be verbally trashed around Middleton High by their son, Richard. I just want to say, Mr. Morris, Eddie, I want to be sure of this. I made my daughter Sarah a promise that she wouldn't be trashed around school. I want to assure that Sarah's reputation will not be trashed verbally or tarnished around the entire school by your son, Richard. Eddie responded. He assured Paul that his daughter, Sarah, will not be trashed around the entire school by his son. I will make Richard keep his mouth shut. I'll be sure of that, Mr. Langston. Richard will keep a civil tongue in his mouth, or I'll pull it out and he won't be able to utter a word again. Sarah was relieved with the responses given by her father and Richard's father, Eddie, that her reputation would not be tarnished or verbally trashed in any way. Sarah looked up to her father and smiled. Thanks, Daddy. She turned to Mr. and Mrs. Morris. She greeted them with thanks. Thanks, Mr. and Mrs. Morris. The Morrises responded back. No problem, little lady. I will make sure that my son doesn't run his big mouth at that schoolhouse. You be sure that will not happen. Charlotte apologized to Sarah. I'm so sorry about this, Sarah and Mr. Langston, and about our son's shortcomings. Paul assured Charlotte that it was no need to apologize for their son, Richard's shortcomings. All right. No need, Miss Morris, no need. All of us need to come together and be decent human beings and come to a solution about what has happened and how we can cope with this situation between our two children. Eddie agreed with Paul concerning their families coming together to cope with Sarah's pregnancy, and for Richard to take responsibility for his actions concerning Sarah and her pregnancy. I agree with you, Paul. I totally agree. We need to come together on this very delicate matter. All right, next page. Well, Eddie, Charlotte, my daughter, and I are going home. It was nice to meet you, Eddie. Paul shook Eddie's hand as he got ready to exit the Morris' household. Mrs. Morris, Charlotte, it was nice to meet you as well. Eddie glanced over at Richard like he was Medusa. Eddie looked towards Richard and was a look for turning Richard into stone. Eddie then looked back at Paul and Sarah with a smile. Since we're going to be grandparents, we look forward to seeing you and your daughter again. Paul responded, I'm glad we came together to talk about this. Thanks for having me and my daughter over on such notice. Paul and his daughter Sarah exited the Morris household. They walked down the walkway to their car. Richard looked out the window of the living room in extreme and total anger towards Sarah. Eddie closed the front door and confronted Richard in his face. What a situation. What has come over you, boy? You think this is funny? You think this situation you helped create is some kind of play toy? This is very serious, Richard. I'm going to make sure you're going to take care of this matter, boy. You can believe that. Eddie walked away from Richard. Richard looked over at his mother, Charlotte. He proceeded to walk away from his mother. Charlotte looked at Richard with disappointment. She stopped Richard in his tracks and gave him an ultimatum. How could you, Richard? After all we talked about. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry, Mom. Richard almost silently said. Charlotte responded back to Richard. I'm going to make sure, as well as your father, that you don't verbally trash Sarah around that entire school either. If I hear anything about it from anyone around that school or in the neighborhood, if I hear a whisper or a peep, or so much as he say, she say rumor, I'm going to beat the ever-loving crap out of you, I promise, and I'll make sure your friends watch, too. Charlotte walked away abruptly from Richard. She left him alone, standing in the middle of the living room floor, in thought of what he helped cause and for not accepting the fact, like a man, that he was, in fact, going to be a father. Meanwhile, at the Wilkinsons' household, Emily made a phone call to Sarah. It was about the situation of her pregnancy. Sarah answered Emily's call. Emily was the first to reply to Sarah. How are you, Sarah? How's it going with you? And how did it go with Richard's parents? The Morrises today, and with Richard. Sarah responded to Emily. I'm doing much better, Emily. Richard confessed to being the father of my baby right in front of his parents. There was no way he could deny it. You're kidding, Sarah. How did Richard's parents get him to confess about the baby? Emily questioned Sarah about Richard's confession. Well, Emily, his daddy was the aggressive one, kind of hard notch, and he was aggravated with Richard. He was mainly the one who got Richard to confess about my pregnancy. Mr. Morris looked as if he wanted to kill Richard when he came down the stairs and confronted my father and I, and his mother too. Emily was shocked as the way Sarah described Richard's father Eddie when it was told about her pregnancy and Richard's involvement. Oh my God, Sarah, you're kidding. What was his mother like? Emily was anxious to know what Richard's mother was like according to Richard's father, Eddie. Emily, Mrs. Morris, had a little spice in her voice as well. She looked like she wanted to slap Richard silly, if you ask me. Emily decided to call her friend Denise in a three-way call. Sarah, do you mind if I call Denise to let her know in on this? She would love to hear about you and Richard. Sarah gave Emily permission to include their friend Denise in their conversation. Next page. Of course, Emily, I don't mind if you let Denise in on our conversation. Emily placed Sarah on hold while she made a three-way call to their classmate and friend, Denise Collins. She waited until the call came through to include her in hers and Sarah's conversation. Denise spoke from the receiving end of the phone at home. Hello, is this you, Emily? Denise on the receiving end. Yes, this is Emily, Denise. What are you doing right now? Emily asked. Nothing, Emily. I'm fine, Denise replied to Emily. Denise, can you hold, please, while I get Sarah back on the phone? Okay, I'll be here, Emily. Denise was put on hold until she got Sarah back on the phone. Emily received Sarah back online. Sarah responded on the receiving end. Emily, you're there? Sarah asked. I'm here, Sarah. Go ahead. Denise, Sarah on the line. Hello, Sarah. How are you doing? Denise asked. I'm great. I'm dealing with my pregnancy very well and what happened at the Morris's house today. Promise me, Denise, you won't say anything to anyone at school or anywhere else about what I'm going to tell you. Promise me. I promise, Sarah. Denise promised Sarah that she won't spill the beans about her pregnancy at school. My daddy was wonderful today. We went to the Morrises and we talked to Richard's parents about not verbally trashing me around the entire school about my pregnancy. Believe me, Denise, Richard's parents were hard-nosed about the whole situation with me and with Richard. They looked like they wanted to kill Richard right then and there. Okay, I understand perfectly, Sarah, Denise said. So what were y'all talking about is keeping the secret about what was said to the Morrises and your pregnancy and Richard being the father of your baby between just us all times without any interference from anyone. That's right, Denise. I can tell you, Richard looked like death in his eyes. He thought he would die after his parents got through with him, Sarah responded. I can't believe it, Sarah, what you're telling me about him and his parents. He really deserves what he get. He's a creep and he's a bad dream dirtbag. Emily enjoyed the conversation with Sarah and Denise, I hear you, Denise. Richard has been doing other people wrong forever and a day. It was getting late, and Sarah had to call it a night with Emily and Denise. Emily, Denise. Well, girls, I can't really talk too long tonight. I got to turn in and get some rest for school tomorrow. I see you in the courtyard tomorrow. The girls all hung up at the same time. Judith in the background. She informed Emily that it was time for bed so that she can be ready for school bright and early the next day. Emily, you need to be in bed. You got school tomorrow. No more phone tonight. Okay, Mama. Good night, Emily said while preparing herself for bed. Good night, Crater Face. Emily returned the insults to her brother Daniel. Can it, dirtbag? Come on, you two. I want you to stop all this foolishness and name calling. I've already told you both about this. Now go to sleep down there. Emily turned off the light and immediately went to sleep. Let me go ahead and turn the page. And we are now at chapter 5 of the Minorites, the pilot. I hope everyone enjoyed my presentation tonight. I appreciate my viewers. I appreciate everyone who viewed my video. And I thank you very much. Like, share, subscribe to my podcast. Hit that notification button to know when I go live. Ring that bell for updates on my podcast. And I would like to also say, if you have a chatter letter you want to send to me, send it to Post Office Box. Well, let me go ahead and give you the title. The Chatterbox Letters Podcast. Post Office Box 5556, Lakeland, Florida 33807. Let me repeat that. The Chatterbox Letters Podcast. Post Office Box 5556, Lakeland, Florida 33807. I would like to also say, God bless everyone who tuned in. I appreciate you. Please send your letter. You can write about anything you want to write about, so long as you keep it clean. Write your letters clear and discreet. Please don't hesitate to write your chatter letter to me. Procrastinate and send your letter today.